What actually is trade? It seems like a simple question, and in fairness, the answer to it is also deceptively simple. Trade is the exchange of goods and or services from one person or one entity to another person and or entity, with money usually being used as a means of exchange. That's really it, but to say it has shaped human history is an understatement. The necessity to move away from a barter system led to the invention of money, and that statement was and remains a popular interpretation. But even here, I have to asterisks and clarify that some people certainly believe that to not be the case, where for example the anthropologist David Graeber argues inside the book Debt, the First 5,000 Years that we invented debt first, with debt then leading to the invention of money. So to be clear, basically everything I've already said, and probably everything I'm going to say moving forward, can be interpreted as a disputed statement. Now to be clear, he also does argue for a lot of interesting things in his book, for example claiming, and I quote here, that markets are founded and usually maintained by systematic state violence, which is one of the opinions of all time. Regardless, I am personally happy to give trade credit for the invention of money, as well as basically being the foundation of human existence itself. Humans would grow food or mine rocks and turn those rocks into things and trade those things with each other for basically all of human history. And indeed, the very concept of trading things now transcends into human language. Work and contributing to society are framed as an individual trading their time for money. 3,600 years ago, that's in the 16th century BC, so like 3,000 years before the start of EU4, we have evidence of tin being mined in Britain and then being traded as far as modern-day Turkey, because people in Turkey were mining copper and needed tin to make bronze. Initially, I wrote down that this is evidence of international trade, but the issue is in the 16th century BC, the concept of a nation wasn't really invented yet, so it wasn't really international trade because no nations were technically involved. Now, one of the main reasons we aren't living in the future utopia is due to the Bronze Age collapse, so we kinda, in Europe anyway, regressed a bit when it comes to our trading. Despite the setback, we then had the subsequent rise of the Phoenician cultures in the Mediterranean, and then Carthage and every other Greek city-state started colonizing other bits of Europe, and in general, trade started happening again. Until Rome came around and basically said, yeah, this is all mine now. You may think this was a bad development for trade, but as it happens, long periods of stable, predictable state control is a good thing for trade. And indeed, while Rome is remembered for chronic civil wars, unrest, and political assassinations, we also have to remember that Rome was basically a world government in Europe for a good chunk of human history, and had a Pax Romana, I would say, between 27 BC to at least 180 AD, or, 207 years of basically straight peace and prosperity. Look, Rome was massive for the growth of global trade, and there's a reason Roman coins were found as far away as the jungles of Vietnam. Rome, of course, would eventually do a Bronze Age collapse, although by the time Rome finally decided to pop its clogs in 1454, with the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire for good at this time, well, we enter Europe deciding it's finally time to take those colonies that Carthage was putting in Spain and put them further away. Europe would bring global trade to the rest of the world, whether the rest of the world wanted it or not. Nations like Britain and the Netherlands would become financial monsters due to the profit from trade, and arguably by the 18th century we basically had global trade set up and ready to stay for good. Industrialization, though, would take this trade and turn it into something fierce, as always increasing in scope. This international trade would still have setbacks, let's be clear. 2 world wars and a Cold War conceptually are not good things for the international flow of goods, but we would walk into a modern economy where global trade is so stupidly efficient. After all, these ships are good at what they do, and we live in a world where pears grown in Argentina can be packed in Thailand and then sold in the US at a profit. Well, what you just got there was a massively simplified, very Eurocentric TLDR of trade. Trade matters, so how is it covered in Paradox titles? Well, before we get into that, I would like to say that a massive subscriber milestone is within sight. 50k subs. Half of 100,000 people. I know it's a tough challenge, but let's work on it and see if we can achieve it. Feel free to contribute yourself by subscribing down below. With that all said, let's get into Imperator Rome. One of the larger criticisms levied against Imperator Rome I have found was that while the underlying systems were pretty good, the flavor that people came to expect from other Paradox titles such as EU4 missions, EU4 focus trees, and Crusader Kings event chains was lacking. While I believe a lack of this flavor can be a significant attribute as to why Imperator Rome failed as a game and was officially abandoned, I have to commend the underlying trade system in Imperator Rome. It's pretty good, honestly. There is a good variety of trade goods, and importing and exporting those trade goods lets you make money taxing your imports and exports. Trade isn't a win button for making money, but it's also not a bad method for it at all. You can be rich without touching trade, but you're also able to get rich from trade if you work with it. There is also an element of supply and demand present. If no one wants to import your iron that you mined, then it just kind of sits there causing a local surplus, but naturally of course you want to export it to make money from taxing at export. There is a decent chunk of common sense moments too, like iron being needed to make heavy legions and horses being needed to make cavalry, and naturally if you want to field elephant units, well you better have the elephant trade good. Regarding historical gameplay, I think it works well to encourage expansion for the conquest of trade goods, which did occur in history, for example invading Egypt to secure domestic production of papyrus. Overall trade is quite important, important and certainly something to bear in mind. It does not take center stage yet, either from a historical point of view or a gameplay point of view at this point, which is fair. And while trade certainly flourished under Rome and the stability provided, Rome as a nation made their fortune from warfare, taxation, and exploitation. I think the system is probably one of the few good and complete aspects of Imperator Rome, and hence deserves its full praise. But with that said, let's move on to Crusader Kings 2 and 3. Christian feudal nations in the Crusader Kings period had a largely agricultural extraction-based economy. Trade happened, certainly, but it was almost a consistent exception, for lack of a better word, compared to the norm. The trade republics of Venice, Pisa, and Genoa in Italy were not the norm. Neither were the trade republics of Novgorod and the institutions of the Hanseatic League. If you go further afield, we have everything from the Silk Road to the trade in sub-Saharan Africa leading to the rise of the Mali Empire. Why do I bring this up? It's because the question of how important trade is answered very differently depending on how far away you are from playing the main characters, quote-unquote. The game is called Crusader Kings after all. The intention for the main gameplay loop is a feudal monarch in Western Europe, in England, in Spain, in France, or in Northern Italy. If you deviate from that, well, the more you deviate, the more important, ironically enough, trade becomes. So when it comes to criticizing trade, its critique and implementation really depends on how far away you are from the intended characters. Another thing to mention is that in Crusader Kings 2, we had a very specific DLC for adding Merchant Republic gaming into the game, which was a good DLC that, well, did just that. You can now partake in Merchant Republic gaming. As part of that, provinces gained trade value based on their development, and I use the word development here to refer to how built up they are with buildings, scaling with their devastation or prosperity, and so on. Then merchant republics could build trade posts that would make money based on the trade value of the province. And you could also, as a non-merchant republic, enjoy a set-up trade post along the Silk Road or that whole sub-Saharan African trade route as well, and I think that implementation of trade is kind of acceptable. I don't think it's particularly good. Trade posts kind of trade with the void, and the best trade building is a big harbour that you can build, but a lot of people that build the big Harbour Grade project aren't even usually playing Merchant Republics. There's a decent level of depth from a roleplay point of view too. China having issues definitely impacts the value of Silk Road trade, for example, and there are events where you can gather a mob of people and use them to burn down your local trade posts. But at best, trade is kind of a feature slapped onto a finished game. And I think this is acceptable given the scope of Crusader Kings is medieval court politics and gameplay. Trade being relegated to a side thing doesn't ruin the immersion of the game itself. And indeed, when you do play as a medieval ruler involved with trade, like a merchant republic or the owner of a trade post, a building pulling money magically from trading is kind of how these would work in the eyes of a local ruler. Your concern, after all, is war and politics, not bartering the price of silk. This is why, despite the lack of trade in Crusader Kings 3, the game still is more than playable unless you're a merchant republic. In which case you should probably wait for the DLC. Indeed, for me, the last three topics that Crusader Kings 3 needs before I can say, okay, it's just a better version of Crusader Kings 2 now in every case, is going to be a Horde DLC, which I believe they're working on, a Merchant Republic DLC that adds trade posts and CK2-esque trade system, and of course a Hidden Societies or even Open Societies DLC. Otherwise, to talk about Crusader Kings 3 trade is to talk about nothing. It doesn't really happen, and even nations that did get rich from trade instead get rich from getting 80 development on high-level ports and farms. Overall, I think that the CK2 implementation of trade is fine, and the CK3 implementation of trade is a coming soon. So with that said, let's move on to EU4. Trade mattered in EU4. I don't want to repeat myself about the importance of trade during this time period because I believe honestly it's pretty self-evident. With that said, the way that trade happens in EU4 is, I think using the term weird would be giving it an undeserved compliment. I'm going to step back from the implementations of trade and address a more meta-level question of what is the purpose of a game mechanic? And there are plenty, ranging from providing opportunities for skill expression as well as modeling aspects of reality that occurred during specific time periods. I actually have a specific video on this topic itself, but the reason I bring it up is that one of the aspects of trade as a game mechanic, ironically enough, is I find to give a reason for empires to expand and colonize in a way that they did historically. See, it makes sense for the Dutch to colonize the Ivory Coast, South Africa, and New Amsterdam from even a metagaming point of view, as these places flow their trade to the English Channel. It makes sense for Spain to go into South America, North Africa, and Mexico, as again, these places flow into Sevilla. If you have a homeland in Persia like the Mughals did, it makes sense to conquer India, as you can steer trade from those areas into Persia, and Siberia is worth colonizing for Russia because Siberia flows into Novgorod. That part of the game is covered well. Another aspect of the game is that taxing trade, or in general making money from trade, is a good way of getting rich. EU4 does not disappoint. In fact, I would go so far as to say that trade in EU4 is far too strong. It prints way too much money, inflates the value of trade goods and province production, and indeed, trade being powerful is one of the issues with of power creep in EU4, because having too much money means you can build more buildings faster, so you can scale even harder, which means you have more manpower, more force limit, more boats, more buildings to deal with governing capacity, and more money to upgrade monuments. Furthermore, more money and more money faster means you get your advisors up and running faster, so you have more mana income, and more mana income means more development, which leads to more everything. The game is inherently exponential, and trade is a money printer that makes your economy explode in value. But what actually is trade in EU4? See, at this point in 2025, following a lot of updates, reworks to national ideas, and new mechanics in EU4, trade isn't trade. It's a fundamentally different mechanic that uses the, for lack of a better word, aesthetics and terminology of trade. Sure, but it's not international trade in the 16th century. I don't want to delve on this topic for a couple of hours, but let's do a quick fire round. Mercantilism is a 16th century trade ideology advocating for stockpiling gold and silver as a measure of national wealth, while ensuring you always run a positive trade balance and basically only trade with your colonies while not trading with anyone else. It's an ideology, but in EU4, the higher the mercantilism you have, the more local trade power your markets generate, and the merchants are also made happier. Sorry, merchants hated mercantilism as it restricted their abilities to trade with other people that were not in your country. But okay, sure. What about free trade? Well, it would be an ideology that is completely incompatible with mercantilism and gained popularity towards the end of EU4, but actually is just an idea in the trade group that gives you a free merchant, and indeed it is in no way incompatible with mercantilism. In fact, most builds that involve taking trade ideas usually end up with a bunch of mercantilism as well. Ships protecting trade also generate this vague trade power, so you can shop outside of China with 1,000 light ships, protect trade, and steal all of China's money without ever declaring war. And tariffs aren't a thing you place on other countries to protect domestic income. No, EU4 tariffs occur when you look at the income that colonies make from tax and production, divide that number by 2 and then multiply by tariff efficiency, meaning that tariffs are just a fancy form of vassal tax, and quite literally do not affect trade in any way at all. Trade efficiency, which is like a vague cloud of a concept, is how good you are at converting trade value, which again is another weird cloud of a concept, into money. And trade steering is the magical process where if you take, say, tea grown in India and send it to London, going through the Cape, then into the Ivory Coast, and finally into the English Channel, you would only get trade steering applied 3 times, so it won't be worth as much as if you were to take the exact same tea, but first you bring it over land through Persia, into Aleppo, into Constantinople, into Ragusa, through Hungary, into Poland, and for some reason, I mean, you're in the area and may as well, drag it through into the Baltic, then into Lubeck, and finally into London. Well, that, you see, involves going through 9 trade nodes instead of 3, so actually assuming 200% trade steering and an initial value of 10, yeah, the tea going through the water makes 15.2 ducats of trade value, while the land route makes you 35 ducats. And 200% trade steering sounds like a lot, but considering you get 100% from just full naval tradition, and trade ideas come with 25% built into it, meaning that literally every single country in the game is capable of getting 125% trade steering, well, yeah, you get the point. You can definitely go even further than that. 200% is a pretty reasonable claim. Indeed, trade steering is one of those modifiers that people use in EU4 to get more than the money cap as income per month, because using this magical modifier means that you're able to turn a random diamond mined in Australia into a literal iPhone by the time it reaches Genoa. And trade remains an issue because it does not matter how well you are doing, it does not matter how amazing and strong your court is. If your trade node sucks, it sucks. You cannot invest into Lhasa enough to change the flow of trade. No amount of money thrown into the Congo turns that awful trade node into anything good. And it does not matter how much you try and make La Plata a global trade hub, it just isn't. The best way of making a bad node good is abandoning the bad node and just conquering a good one. And the best way of dominating trade is just to kill everyone you're actually trading with so no one can steal your trade. Trade in EU4 is a cool system to mess around with and have campaigns around. It's a great system for power trip metagamers because it prints money, but it basically has nothing actually to do with real trade. As mentioned before, trade in EU4 adopts the language of trade and the exchange of goods, but it's more of a system of you produce this thing in the colonies or territories, now make it travel as far as possible and as safely as possible to collect it in your trade capital. There's also no real trade or exchange between nations. Let's be honest, Portugal setting up a sugar plantation doesn't mean France can now buy sugar from Portugal. What I believe is the most ironic thing about all of this is that taking the Imperator Rome system, for example, and expanding on that would have been a better implementation of this mercantilism that we actually saw in this time period. But I cannot in good faith endorse a system where steering tea from India through mainland Europe is well over twice as profitable as just shipping it straight through the sea. Trade routes don't become better when they are longer. If anything, the shorter the travel time, the better. And with that cope aside, let's move on to Victoria 3. Victoria 3 is a game that I have criticized a lot in the past. See, the whole combat system is a peak innovation of vague front lines using quantum physics to determine where the units actually are. Meanwhile, the domestic policy of a country is akin to spinning a roulette wheel, where if you want to abolish slavery, well, you better hope it lands on black. With that said, the economic aspect of Victoria 3, including trade, is really good. Like, honestly, price isn't an arbitrary greatest 2.5 ducats each we decided. There's a genuine supply and demand system for it, which is different in different markets. The market system itself is pretty well developed, with trade routes where you take goods to other markets for profit being a system that makes sense. Tariffs aren't just retextured vassal tax, but actually impact trade directly by increasing the price of the final trade good, and treaty ports work, like they give you access to the actual markets, so it makes sense getting them, instead of in EU4 where the benefits of grabbing a treaty port from China is, oh neat, you have a trade power in this area now, enjoy. You can oversupply and undersupply a trade good, and even supply isn't just an arbitrary, this province produces X supply for an army, but an actual logistics system, even if it is militarily adjacent and hence suffers from the consequence of Victoria 3 military innovation. Now, of course, there are still paradox innovations in general. Where would we be without them? A famous example that, to be clear, did get fixed is a country remains part of your suzerain's market when launching an independence war, the consequence of which meant that if you were India and you declared war on Britain, you were still forced to buy all the guns you were using to shoot at the British, only from Britain. Also, you were forced to keep exporting the stuff you were making during your independence war to Britain until you actually won the war. Now, does this get fixed? To be clear, you make your own market now when you declare the war, and you can now buy guns from not just your overlord. Frankly, it's a weird spot to be in, because despite the rest of Victoria 3 having innovations which I will choose to not get into today, Victoria 3 deserves a genuine commendation regarding trade and the overall economic system. I think not only does it get that pretty right, it's also a very important thing to get right in a game like Victoria 3. I, again, have only praised here, which is ironic because I never thought I would be saying that in the Victoria 3 section. But unconditional praise does have an issue, namely that outside of pointing and going, a local good system? That's good. There isn't much to talk about, so we're going to move on to Hearts of Iron 4. Hearts of Iron 4 is at its core a World War II simulator. As part of this abstraction, one of the things that they got rid of is money. The closest thing to money is civilian factories, and hence trade in Hoi 4 is super utilitarian. Civilian factories are exchanged for raw resources to produce things, or buy finished weapons after they added an arms dealer DLC into the game. As such, in an almost poetic twist of irony given the average political views of the Hoi 4 audience, the Hoi 4 economy works like an anarchist critique of communism. I know, right? Hoi 4, but hear me out. Money is entirely removed from the system. The value of things produced is entirely determined by the amount of labor needed to produce it. The state, even in democratic nations, would absolute unquestioning power and builds whatever it wants, wherever it wants. It's optimal to produce as few civilian goods as possible, with any civilian production quite literally disappearing into the void, and the only thing that the government actually builds is machines of war. All state infrastructure exists not to build trains and help the civilian population move around, but to supply troops and extract resources more efficiently. And naturally, to really hammer the nail into the coffin, as it were, if you do go and buy foreign military equipment, you don't do so with money, but with the value of civilian factory production. Basically, you're paying for things in terms of human labor. So yes, an anarchist critique of communism, because every country in the world is a functioning communist state, but it uses this communism to wage war and ignore the population as hard as possible. Quite literally, again, the only thing you can build is military things. You can build armor factories, but you can't build schools and hospitals. Now, I think Hoi 4 is clearly way too far along its development cycle to add money at this point. Doing so would need a rework of every single mission tree ever. So I think it's probably best to just leave it as is at this point. And in truth, and I want to ask this genuinely, does it matter? At its core, Hearts of Iron 4 is a World War II game. When you think of trade during World War II, you think of an import of resources like rubber and oil for the war economy, or for example Sweden selling iron ore to Germany, if you really read into stuff. The Hoi 4 system is objectively bad, sure, if you want the ultimate realistic war experience, but also at the same time, subjectively, the Hoi 4 trade system for resources works. At the end of the day, Hoi 4 is a power trip simulator for a wannabe World War II general, and the fun part of the game is building up your military industry, putting a plan into action, and executing said military build within that gameplay loop. The way that trade and frankly the whole economy is presented subjectively works for that purpose. As such, despite basically an entire section that is one long criticism, I actually think that trade in Hoi 4 and in fact the whole economy sits in the Crusader Kings 2 domain of, yeah, it's not the best demonstration of this mechanic, but given the scope of the game, good enough. And with that said, we move on to Stellaris. Stellaris didn't start with trade, and it was added to the game in Update 2.2, which also added mega corporations. Trade value is generated passively through some space deposits, and also every single pub generates some trade value based on their living standards. But the main source of trade is merchants and clerics. This generated trade is then either collected by your main trade capital station, or collected by other stations and shipped across to the main station. It's the EU4 trade system, with all of its flaws. Trade seems to be a concept that operates in the Stellaris universe as a purely mercantilist endeavor, where you want to print trade value in your own land, send it to your empire trade capital, and collect the trade value to gain benefits. Trade doesn't involve exchanging things with other people, and in truth, trade is quite literally just another resource like energy credits or minerals or even food. Trade is mined or grown or generated, okay, probably the third word is better, by specialist trade buildings that build trade. And much like certain policies or civics have bonuses to mining minerals harder, there are civics and bonuses for generating trade harder. That trade is then converted into energy, or energy as well as unity, or energy as well as consumer goods. That's it. There's mini games, of course, like piracy if your trade routes get too lucrative for the pirates to ignore, and increasing your stability on planets to get more trade value. But yeah, trade is slapped on Crusader Kings 2 start, where they were like, right, people playing Stellaris want trade. EU4. EU4 has a trade system. That looks cool. Just use that, call it a day. But we are talking about Stellaris developers, so they couldn't quite call it a day. After all, they had to rework at least one core aspect of the game as well. So in this case, they decided to rework, the entire government system. So yeah, that happened. They reworked the entire government system, added trade, added the whole Megacorp expansion, and that was enough for the DLC. I think for me, though, that the greatest source of disappointment is that the actual trade can happen. You can go to other nations and negotiate trade for them, saying, hey, I'll give you 600 food a month, and you give me 400 minerals a month as a deal with a random alien, for example. And there's literally a galactic commodity market called the Galactic Market, where you go and buy or sell your commodities, trading everything from food to, say, exotic gases and dark matter. They unironically over time added a trade system into the game, but also kept the weird EU4-esque trade as a trade value resource mechanic, because honestly it's Stellaris, at this point why not? So to conclude, I believe the best in terms of true to life trade systems that also serve the game well can be found in Victoria 3 or Imperator Rome. The trade systems in Crusader Kings 2 and Hearts of Iron 4 are quite bare bones, but given the nature of the games, I think that's fine, and Crusader Kings 3 trade system isn't in the game yet. With that said, EU4 and Stellaris kind of share the same trade innovations, although Stellaris kind of redid its homework and over time re-added trade without getting rid of the trade system it had initially. And hey, while the EU4 trade system may be a mess, at least it makes up for it by allowing people like me to have an amazing power trip. With that all said and done, that is going to be all the time I have for today. Thank you very much for watching, with a special thank you to my channel members, especially Ark, Solar, W Haste, Solemon, Star72, Lord Zendikar, Nick Fassbender, Nanhatan, Nick Huss, The Awesome Rabbit, Best Pro Gaming, Grandmo Flavian, Connor, Andreas Alberg, Decky, Sob, Mobkiller, Anthony35, AC Napo, Glorious Leader, Zerkis, and Mr. Kumshok.